I didn't come to Blackridge to make friends. I came for a contract. 6 months to overhaul the logistics software at the grain co-op. Reconcile the mess of inventory that always happens at the tail end of harvest season. Document a process, collect a check, and leave. The recruiter said it was quiet, a place to catch up on sleep and not get into trouble. It was quiet in the way a shut door is quiet. Quiet like a held breath. The town sits in a low bowl of land where the wind never fully stops. On my first morning, I drove past houses with peeled paint and porches deeper than they needed to be. Past a church with a steeple a little crooked. Past a diner called Leona's, where the chalkboard promised hot beef sandwich Wednesday. Like that was a holiday. The streets were straight and the trees were old enough to lean toward each other. The further you walk from Maine, the more the town dissolves into fields. Black dirt, stubby corn stubble, hooped irrigation rigs that look skeletal in the dawn. People nodded to me without stopping. That was fine. I wasn't there for them. I rented the top half of a divided farmhouse on Sawmill Road. The landlord, a man named Hal, met me with a ring of keys that clanked like a warning. "If one doesn't work, the next will," he said, and laughed at his own joke. He showed me the fuse box, the water heater, the window that sticks, the one you never open because it falls out, and the bit of carpet near the bedroom doorway you have to step around because there's soft floorboards there. "We ain't had a carpenter in a while." "Okay," I said. "Thanks." "About the sirens," he said, like he'd just remembered. "They test 'em first Monday of the month at noon. Nothing to worry about. Couple more times, too, if there's weather rolling in." He squinted at the sky. It was blue and plain and empty. And sometimes when there ain't. I thought he was being folksy and weird the way rural people can be around strangers. Later, I decided he was practicing a kind of honesty. I started work on a Tuesday. The co-op office smelled like paper and mouse droppings and burned coffee. The manager, a woman named Audrey, shook my hand firmly and gave me a stack of logbooks to look over whenever. The grain shed doors were open. Trucks nosed in slow as cattle, dumped and rattled off, their drivers pale and silent behind the glass like fish. I fell into a rhythm. Wake at 6 to the wind wrinkling the cotton curtains. Shower slowly because the water came hot in surges. Drive to Leona's for coffee and eggs and to be stared at by the morning crowd. Work with an almanac of surnames, Hartley, McKean, Elders, Oxley, and learn that everyone shared cousins and resentments. Take lunch at my desk, drive back to a sunset that pooled like watered-down blood into the fields. Eat microwaved food on the sagging couch. Sleep with the feeling that something had entered the room after the lights went off and was standing just at the corner of my bed, patient, waiting to be acknowledged. It took 30 days for that feeling to have a shape. On day 30, a couple disappeared. Their names were Tyler and Jessa. I knew them like you know anyone you share a room with every morning. Name first, then habit. They sat 2 stools down from me at Leona's. Jessa liked her hash browns extra crispy. Tyler always stole one, and then made a face because he'd burned his mouth every time. He wore a dairy cap with a blue cow. She worked at the daycare. He installed satellite dishes. They were both 22 and still gave off that intact light people have when they haven't had to pay for anything with more than money. On day 31, they weren't at breakfast. No big deal. People get sick, sleep in, forget. On day 32, the daycare called Leona's because Jessa hadn't picked up her noon shift. Leona called Audrey because the town is a spider web, and every thread runs back to the same hands. By afternoon, everyone knew, except, I guess, the couple's mothers, who were trying not to understand what the silence on the other end of the phone meant. I expected panic. In a big city, you'd have sirens and volunteers and Facebook posts blowing up with the same blurry photo being shared again and again, a pleading caption and a string of prayer hands. In Blackridge, the sheriff drove by Tyler's trailer and then by Jess's apartment, really an attic with a door, and parked by the diner to do paperwork. People spoke in the tone you use when you discuss weather. You hear about Tyler and Jessa. Mister. The men on the stool row at Leona's shrugged from within their denim like turtles. You check the dam, asked one. You check the quarry, asked another. No point, said the sheriff with no malice or rush. Not yet. He made a circuit of the town twice, like an old toy winding down. It took me a while to realize the thing I was hearing wasn't indifference. It was recognition. I tried to talk to Audrey about it when she came to my desk to ask how the quarterly reconciliation was going. She looked past me and said, "It's going." When I pressed, she said, "Things happen everywhere," and then, "You keep your receipts in order and we'll be fine," and finally, "Don't go out on Sawmill after dark," which she said like she was telling me how to reboot a server if it froze. That evening, I drove Sawmill Road on purpose because people tell you not to do things, and so you do them. Dust shook up in the gray like the road was eroding into moths. The wind pushed at my car. The fields were a flattening dark. At one point, I saw someone had stacked small stones at the end of a driveway in two neat piles, with a gap between them, a kind of gate. A child's toy sat in the ditch, a pink phone with the fake screen half snapped off. The plastic had faded to chalk. I took it home anyway. I told myself I'd throw it away in the morning, but I didn't. It sat on the kitchen counter next to my keys. At 1 a.m., I woke up with the sour certainty that someone was speaking to me. Not in the room, too close outside. I got up and cracked the kitchen window an inch. The wind carried nothing distinct, but there was a rhythm in it that didn't belong to the maples. I thought I could pick out something shaped like syllables, like the soft spool of a name being wound up and let loose along the fields again and again. It wasn't my name. That should have helped. It didn't. 2 weeks later, a second couple disappeared. I didn't know them except as people other people knew. Dana from the library and Mark from the feed store. She had hair like a helmet and a smile like a blade. He had that deep farmer pallor where the skin is both leather and milk. They were both the kind of person who says hello to you, even if you're standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they have every right to scold you for it. When the shelf of seed guides collapsed because I leaned on the wrong end, Mark helped me stack the books back, and Dana said, "You're new, so it's only a sin if you do it twice." No one at the library laughed. She did. That morning, the siren sounded at 10:37. It wasn't Monday. The whale rose in a neat, contained column like smoke and then shut off in a way that made my jaw click. People in the office paused and then resumed. Audrey didn't look up. "It ain't weather," she said to the air. I went to Leona's because I didn't know what else to do with the part of me that was suddenly humming. The lunch rush was sparse, but the silence was loud. The sheriff came in and didn't order. He stood there with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops like he was holding his own hands back from something, like he'd been taught not to touch. He looked over everyone once, carefully, as if counting heads. He said, "It's 2." A man by the window nodded. An old woman shook her head, but not in disagreement. More like resignation, like the way you shake rain off your coat. Someone muttered, "Too quick." The man replied, "Depends on the year." Leona wiped the counter the way you wipe a grave, slow, avoiding the edges. I said, "To what?" And it felt like I was interrupting a prayer. Leona looked at the sheriff for permission to speak to me. He didn't give it. He didn't refuse it either. She settled for pity. "Couples," she said, "it's 2. Sometimes it's only 1. It used to be 3. Used to. Back when the river hadn't been fixed. Back when the tracks still ran. 2 what? I insisted, stupid with the effort of not accepting how easily the information slid into the room. Leona's mouth thinned. This is a place that takes. Not always the same way. Not always the same things. But it takes. The sheriff said to me, "New folks tend to talk big. Then they learn the history and they stop talking. Or they leave." I said, "What history?" "Town libraries open Mondays and Thursdays," said Leona, as if that were a helpful answer. I spent the afternoon in the library because there's a special kind of courage that feels like research. It's the courage of putting space between yourself and what you are afraid to name. The building had that municipal smell of old paper and damp carpet. Dana's desk was empty, chair pushed in as neatly as a closed mouth. A woman with a braid and a name tag that said Carol stood up when I entered. "Good afternoon," she intoned, invoking a spell of normalcy. I told her I wanted to see the papers from back then. I said it the way locals do, with no dates attached, trusting the phrase to pull the right drawer open. Carol brought me 6 volumes of Blackridge Ledger, bound in red buckram that had faded unevenly to a color like raw meat. I read backward and forward, and out of sequence because the past doesn't arrange itself to make sense for you. There were wedding announcements printed under the headline, "Tying Knot," with the names spelled differently in 2 places and no one correcting it. There were little squares of grief with the same prayer over and over like a hammer. There will be rest. Every few years, the intervals weren't mathematically perfect, but they weren't random. There was a margin note that repeated a word. It wasn't a word I'd seen in any index. It wasn't a word I wanted to say out loud. Host. Not a host, like a party host. Host, like the word a priest says when he's lifting something fragile and holy that is also a mouth. A small round of bread. A thin disc, porous and empty and alive. The notes weren't articles. They were balm put on a wound you couldn't photograph. The host was appeased. Or the host required less this year. Or the host was cruel. Sometimes the margin note paired with something the town could name. A storm that scoured the topsoil off the fields to the depth of 2 inches. A barn fire that stepped neatly from street to street. A boy missing, then returned with his eyes like penny glass. Sometimes the note sat alone. That frightened me more. "Find what you need," Carol asked, promptly at 5, the way you approach someone standing at the very edge of a cliff. "Sure," I lied. "Thanks." "You leaving soon?" she asked. "Leaving the library?" "Leaving town?" "Not yet." She said, with the entire weight of history in the hum. "Well, Thursday's another day." I drove home with the light lowering itself down into the ditches until the whole world was a set of shallow bowls of dusk. On Sawmill, I slowed by the driveway with the 2 stone piles. The piles had grown higher, and the gap between them had narrowed. I had the sudden, childish impulse to move a rock just to see if anyone noticed. I kept the impulse where it belonged, in my hands, gripping the wheel too hard. That night, I dreamed I was kneeling in a field and couldn't stand, like my legs were pressed into the earth by the tip of a giant finger. When I woke, Both knees ached as if I'd been praying on concrete. The next morning at the co-op, Audrey put a form on my desk. "Policy for after hours," she said. "In effect the next 3 nights. Close up before dusk. Don't leave the premises between dusk and dawn unless there's an emergency, and then you call the sheriff before you do." "Because of the disappearances?" I asked. "Because of the wind," she said. "Because of kids who don't know better. Because of what happens when you go calling where you shouldn't." "I live on Sawmill," I said. "That's fine," she said. "That's better." "Why is that better?" "Because most of what lives here likes to travel straight." Whatever I was doing with invoices and spreadsheets became the sideshow. The main act was a decision I convinced myself I hadn't already made. I would stay and see. I would collect data and assemble a shape out of it because that's what my job is in every other context. Surely the town had simply learned how to narrate its tragedies in a way that made them survivable. Surely there was no host except what a place cannot carry without being vindictive. People say surely when they are constructing a small fence. Fences don't stop anything that flies. The first night of the after-hours policy, I locked up the co-op at 5:30 and sat in my car until the sky went the color of a bruise you don't want your friends to see. The streetlights in Blackridge are the old kind that ring their heads with a trembling halo of insect, so thick it looks like the light is giving birth to its own shadow. Something ticked in the metal of the grain elevator, one of those ballooning sidewall noises that suggests the building is remembering its own weight. I drove to Leona's because waiting is easier with other people present. The place was full, but no one was eating. Everyone had coffee. The cups were not put down. The sheriff stood with his back to the door, facing the far wall as if guarding it. In the far booth, a man I recognized by shape but not name stood up and said, without preamble, "She can have him." Leona said softly, "Bert?" "It's better," the man said, as if changing the weather by saying so. He stared at the table and breathed like lifting a box. "It's better this way." A woman near the pies said, "It's only 2," and that sentence used up the room's air. Several people nodded, mouths trembling from the effort of keeping themselves the way they were. The sheriff said, to the man and to no one, "You remember your coat when you go," like a charm. I wanted to ask who the she and she can have him was. I didn't. The question felt like standing up in church and clapping on the wrong beat. On the second night, someone knocked on my door at 12:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I was sitting on the floor of the kitchen with my back against the cabinets and the pink toy phone on the table, telling myself stories about how normal I was. The knock was gentle but confident. I didn't move. It came again. If you've ever been in a room with a trapped bird, you know the sound a small creature makes when it has access to every inch of space except the one it wants. That sound was in the knock. "Hello?" a woman's voice said. It was even and neutral, the way a bank teller might ask if you need a withdrawal slip. "I forgot my scarf." "You have the wrong place," I said, because that's the kind of sentence that keeps the wolves out. "Leona sent me," she said, then added a plausible detail so reasonable it made me dizzy. "She said you had found it on Sawmill Road." The pink phone on the table looked suddenly guilty. "What's your name?" I asked. "Jessa," the woman said, and she said it like it was the first time she'd used that name in a while. I left my scarf at the end of the driveway. The wind took it. You know how it is. I did not know how it was. My legs prickled, a slow snow of nerves. Between us, the empty porch. Between us, a door with a deadbolt I hadn't yet upgraded, and a chain I had. I pictured the chain popping off its screws with a neat tug, because the wood was soft there. I pictured Hal's keys clanking again. I pictured the 2 stone piles and the shrinking gap. "I don't have your scarf," I said. "Then it's good you opened my door," she said, and there was a smile in her voice now. "That means it will come home." "I didn't open anything," I said, and realized I was wrong. I'd cracked the kitchen window earlier. The gap was an inch. I crossed the room and shut it. From the porch, nothing. No audible anger, no footsteps, no leaving. After a minute, 5, 10, a different knock. Softer, lower, almost feline. A weight leaned casually against the door. I stayed on the kitchen floor until the light came. In the morning, Leona poured coffee and asked me, too casually, "You get company last night?" The sheriff, 2 stools down, looked at me like I was a document he needed to file. "Someone lost a scarf," I said. "No," Leona said, so quickly it was a slap. "No, don't use their words. Whose?" She rubbed a spot on the counter longer than it needed. "You should make your calls, if you're going to get out." "I have a contract," I said. "I can't just leave." "People break them all the time," she said, "for jobs that are less than living." In the afternoon, I drove to the end of Sawmill, where the road gives up being a road and surrenders to the private gravel that leads to the river. There are signs that say, "No trespassing," the way some houses say, "Bless this home." The stone piles were taller. There were marks chalked on the road, thin white lines that met in shapes that hurt to look at. I told myself some farm kid had drawn them to see how soon the rain would wash them away. But there hadn't been rain. The foam of the chalk was too white. I thought of teeth. The third night, the siren didn't sound. The wind did. Around 2 in the morning, it changed direction like a creature circling the bed to find the place where your breath is easiest to steal. The house shifted. Somewhere far off, something slammed metallic. Not a door, something looser, like a long sheet of tin ripped and then allowed to slap back against its nails. The sound came again, and again. A rhythm, then. A calling. People say the Midwest is empty, but it is precisely the opposite. It is full of space that would like to be filled. You feel it in your bones if you sit still long enough. The fields extend themselves like a hand, palm up. Add to that the deliberate emptiness people make. Torn down barns, abandoned silos, the quarry with its pools of water the color of coins left at the bottom of wishes. And you realize this is a place that accumulates what others have set down. It is a host of a different kind. On the 4th night, I did something reckless disguised as responsible. I put the pink toy phone back in the ditch where I found it. I told myself I was returning lost property, resetting a game to the last saved point. I drove there at dusk. The stone piles were taller. The chalk was thicker, and the gap between the stones was now a slit your body might be persuaded to pass through with the right encouragement. I set the phone exactly where I'd picked it up. A gust of wind rolled it onto its fake screen, and it stared up at me with the painted image of a call in progress. 00 on the timer, no name. I left it and went home. Sometime after midnight, footsteps on the porch. Someone hummed at my door, tuneless, lips closed. The sound had the particular intimacy of a mother soothing a child, except that the rhythm wavered in ways no human breath could. Every time it broke off and began again, the break was a fraction too long, the restart a fraction too abrupt, as if the body doing the humming had to remember what lungs were for. The handle turned, testing the latch. "That's not the right door," a man said. A woman answered, "We'll make it a right one." I sat with my back against the door and counted. At 100, I had learned nothing. At 1,000, the humming stopped. At 1,005, the window in the bedroom slid upward hard enough to crack the paint where it stuck. A draft walked down the hall and found my mouth. I swallowed it and called the sheriff. "Leave it shut," he said, and I said, "What?" And he repeated, "Everything. Leave everything shut." I didn't open anything. "You're talking to me," he said gently. "You opened something." By morning, the town had the look of a place that has decided to be openly tired. People's clothes weren't quite buttoned right. The hairline of the world had shifted. I went to the co-op and found Audrey already there, standing at the window with the blinds angled up. "We'll be closing early today," she said, "because of the wind." "Because it's time," she said. "Every 7 years, give or take. Depending on how the church does, depending on how the water table sits, depending on how much we took without putting back." "What happens?" I asked. She gave me a look that said, "I appreciate your effort at being the kind of person who believes he can manage things by naming them." Then she said, "A lot of folks like to spend the afternoon at Leona's, not because it helps, just because it is a thing to do with your hands." I went to Leona's because that's what you do here. The diner was full to its corners. The sheriff stood again with his back to the door, a sentinel in reverse. Leona moved like a person whose motion keeps other people from breaking. Someone had put a cardboard box on the counter and written on it in marker, "If you got extras, flashlights, batteries, salt." Salt, I thought. Then, of course. At 1 o'clock, all the phones in the diner vibrated at once. The sound was a hard swarm. People reached for them in sync and looked down with expressions that weren't shock but weren't exactly acceptance either. A message from no one and everyone. Stay inside. Lock doors. Don't answer. The sheriff's jaw clenched. Leona closed her eyes. In the lull after the wave of haptics, a song started somewhere. Tinny, childish, maddeningly sweet. It took me a second to place it. The pink toy phone. Its battery should have been dead a decade ago. The song continued long enough for someone to find the humor in it, then longer than humor could tolerate, then longer still. It kept on, becoming an instrument for scraping the inside of your ears. "Does it always—" I started. "No," Leona said, and poured a coffee into a cup that no one would drink. "This year will be different." "Is different better?" "No." The man who had announced yesterday that she can have him was not in the diner that day. No one spoke his name. Saying a person's name here makes them more present. It is an invitation. We didn't need more guests. At 4, the light did something I have never seen light do. It thinned instead of dimming, like it had been cut with water. At 4:30, every floorboard in Leona's creaked in sequence, like someone had walked the length of the building inside the walls. People didn't look at each other. They concentrated on whatever was in front of them, with intensity, like they were trying to burn a hole in it through which they could exit. At 5, the first door in town slammed. It wasn't Leona's. It was far off. Another followed. Then a third, closer. The sheriff's radio squawked with static and he turned it off gently, like putting a child to bed. A wind pressed its face against the windows and held that breath, not fogging the glass, just asserting presence. I watched the diner lights flicker once, then steady. The chalkboard menu rattled. The PA system that plays Leona's music at lunch, classic country, popped once like a bubble rising. Then a voice came through it. Not a song, not a person's voice, not even a sound you could say syllables shaped. A pressure, a tone that made me feel like my blood had been turned to a metal filing cabinet, and someone was running a magnet along it to drag every part against its rails. People lifted their cups to their lips and didn't drink. "Hold, please," Leona said out loud to the room and to the thing that was here. The voice in the PA answered by changing, by becoming thinner, like it was squeezing through gauze. For a second I thought I could pick out a pattern. I felt the unmistakable sensation of being counted. After, I can't tell you precisely how things happened because I was awake for all of it. Not the way we use that phrase to mean I didn't sleep. I mean the way we say the dog is awake when it hears a sound we don't. My ears were too much ear. My eyes too much eye. A list of facts. The diner's front door never opened, but the bell above it rang many times. There were footsteps inside the walls, and some set of tiny feet ran along the baseboards like rain. At one point, the cash register sprang and a quarter rose on its edge and rolled to the end of the counter and fell. But no one had touched the register. A child giggled under the counter. The sound was located, but the source wasn't. Leona said, "Not yet," the way you'd say it to a toddler who wants dessert before dinner. Someone started praying. Not the formal prayer I grew up with, but something like reciting a grocery list of names you love until you collapse. Not asking for anything, only asserting that those names have been. The sheriff said one name under his breath, over and over, until it lost its vowels and became more wind than word. At exactly 6, the pink toy phone stopped playing its song, and the silence it left behind was shaped like a cutout where a child might crawl. At some point in all this, the man whose name we didn't say must have decided something. He stood up, and in the movement of his body I saw the past and the ledger and the margin note and the chalk on the road and the way the town had learned to narrate itself to itself. He didn't look at anyone. He took his coat. He went to the door. The sheriff did not stop him. No one begged him. The door opened. The wind didn't push in like you'd expect. It receded, as if drawing a breath to make space. The bell rang and then didn't stop ringing, the metal vibrating until I thought it would wear itself thin. The man stepped out. The door clicked shut behind him. When the bell finally ceased, the PA cleared its throat. Ridiculous phrase, but that's what it did, and tried to produce one last sound. It failed. The lights did not flicker again. The pressure left the room the way a heavy person leaves a couch. A long exhale and a sadness in the cushions. We all sat. No one wept. Leona put a bowl of gumdrops on the counter as if to mark a return to routine. The sheriff said, "Don't," when I started to stand. Then he nodded, and I understood. Don't go look. Don't name it. Don't widen the path. By morning, the town had returned itself to itself. If you drove down Main at 8, you'd think some minor maintenance had occurred. A branch fallen and neatly stacked, a window's crack newly taped, a set of footprints in dust wiped with a wet rag. At 9, the daycare opened with a note. Staff request your patience. At 10, the co-op printed out forms and the fax machine shouted at itself. At noon, the siren sounded once, a little. At 1, the sheriff sat at the counter and ate a piece of pie and closed his eyes and tasted it. He set his fork down as if putting away a tool at the end of a job. There was no announcement, no article. If you kept your own ledger, as I had begun to, you could write 2 couples, 1 man, no storm, chalk thick, host appeased. If you were a kinder narrator, you'd write, "The town didn't break." I stayed. You'll ask why. People do when I tell this story in the kinds of bars where out-of-towners end up when the highways blur. They say, "Why didn't you run?" And I say, "Because running is a direction, not a decision." I had a contract. I had receipts to reconcile. I had sleep to catch up on. I had the particular stubbornness of men who believe the world can be archived. The day after, I bought a better deadbolt. I replaced the screws in the chain latch with longer ones that bit harder into the studs. I set my coffee maker to go off at 6:05 and felt victorious when it did. For a week, nothing happened. The wind behaved like a wind. The toy phone lay where I'd left it, and someone else's tire track smudged it into the ditch until it looked like a broken smile. The stone piles at the driveway stayed at their height. Now that I knew to look, I saw the chalk marks everywhere. Not always white. Sometimes in flour on doorsteps. Sometimes in salt on windowsills. Sometimes in strings of beads hung in patterns only visible if you squinted. The town had dressed itself for an event, and then undressed so only the imprint remained. Then, in the second week, a new kind of thing. A woman at Leona's asked me, "You like to fish?" I said yes, because that's the sort of thing you say yes to in a town like this. Everything is an invitation with a purpose. She told me her brother had a place where the quarry edges out into Real River, and the fish hold near a fallen cottonwood. "Go at dawn," she advised. "That's when they take." She smiled thinly. "That's when we all take." At dawn, I parked near the no trespassing sign and walked down a gravel slope into a seam of trees that looked the way the inside of a larynx feels. Intricate and damp and alive with the movement of breath. The river's surface lay uncommitted, a sheet of dull pewter. I cast badly and got the line stuck in a branch and cursed the way you do when you want to be part of a place but fail at its simplest language. The bank on the opposite side was high and cut, its layers exposed like a jawbone. In it, I could see the striations of years, drought lines like ribs, flood lines like bruises, pockets of darker soil that made no sense in the way a photograph of a ghost makes no sense. If you don't want to see it, you don't. Something moved there. Not big. Human size. I knew immediately I wasn't alone, and I knew equally that I wasn't in danger. Not that kind. The figure stood halfway up the cut bank, at a shelf that looked like it had been carved with the flat of a hand. It turned its head toward me in a movement that described the shortest possible arc between 2 points. I didn't wave. I didn't call out. I stood with my hands loose at my sides, like a person who had entered the wrong room of a funeral home and doesn't know which end of the hallway contains the people he loves. After a long moment, the figure stepped back into the bank and was gone. Not down, not up, in. I went home and sat in the shower and let the water oscillate from hot to cold to hot, and told myself sensible things about sinkholes and animal dens and the tricks morning light plays when it goes through leaves and water at the same time. I spun a net of science around the shape of what I had seen. The net held. For a while. That afternoon, the sheriff came to the co-op and asked Audrey if he could borrow me. "What for?" she asked, like a mother. "For a chat," he said, like a father. We sat in his cruiser on the edge of town, in the kind of shade you get from a tree that has seen a lot of things and stopped reporting them. He said, "You're going to leave. I know it. I'm not trying to talk you out of it. Before you do, though, I'd like you to hear something. Not from here. From me." I waited. "When I was a boy," he said, "we used to make forts in the culverts under the road. It was stupid. The floodwater out here comes quick if it comes at all, and it moves a lot of grit. My father told me not to. So I did. There's a stretch on Old Creek where the culvert is double, side by side. During dry times you can walk it. I was in there once when I heard... He paused, searching for a word he would accept. Not a voice. Not an animal. Not water. Something like when your mama hums while she scrubs your scalp. It was comforting, even when it was wrong. He stared out over the field where nothing was happening. Some of us stayed. Some of us left. I got a job where I could do one good thing sometimes by standing still in a place where maybe nobody should. I said, eventually, because something was required of me. Why are you telling me this? Because when you leave, he said, and there was no conditional in it, you'll tell it like a story. People will nod at the right parts. They'll want to know why we do what we do. You can tell them whatever you want. Just don't tell them we don't grieve. We sat there in the cruiser with the windows half down. Flies smacked lazily against the glass like heaviness with wings. In the passenger footwell, a bag of rock salt sat like a pet. The sheriff didn't ask me to stay. I didn't promise to go. I finished out my contract. You don't need the administrative details of a town returning to itself. They're not boring exactly. They just belong to a different narrative. Take them as a sign of recovery the way you check a person's pulse. I drank coffee. I reconciled numbers. I nodded at people at the grocery. I learned the names of the dogs and which ones were allowed to wander. I learned to stand with my feet a certain way in the doorway of Leona's so that my body made a shape that meant I was here to listen, not to take. I went to church once and was startled when the host in the priest's hand made me swallow even though I didn't kneel. I ran my fingers along the chalk once after a rain and found that it hadn't dissolved. It had sunk in, made itself part of the road. On my last day, the town put on a face like seeing your child off to college. People told me, "You did good," as if I had done anything. Audrey shook my hand and told me if I ever needed a reference for work that involved keeping your head, she'd write what I required. Leona made me a sandwich that wasn't on the chalkboard and put a slice of pie next to it and didn't take my money. The sheriff tipped his cap in a way that wasn't folksy and said, "Drive straight. Don't stop by the river." I put my bags in the car. In the kitchen, on the counter where the pink phone had rested, there was a scarf. Not Jess's. Not anyone's I recognized. It was red, but not like blood. Red like a schoolhouse in a coloring book. There was no note. I stood with it in my hands for a long time. If I was that kind of person, I would say I left it there and walked out with my palms empty. That would make for a clean ending. But I am not that person, and clean endings are a fiction of cowards. I folded the scarf. I put it in the trunk. On Sawmill, I slowed at the driveway without deciding to. The stone piles were lower now. Their gap widened. The chalk marks had been scuffed like letters rubbed out by another class. The ditch was shallow. The toy phone lay face up, cracked, and streaked with fine mud. As I passed, some trick of sun through a cloud, some glint off a milkweed blade, made the little painted screen look like it had changed. I braked. I reversed. I put the car in park. I rolled down the window and peered out. The call timer read 00:01. I pulled away and drove and did not stop until the interstate had swallowed me. The wind at that speed is different. It has less personality. It has no memory of you. In the rear view, the ribbon of road unrolled like a slow forgiveness. On the passenger seat, The scarf had slid out of the bag and lay there like an answer I was not ready to translate. That night, 200 miles away, in a motel with carpet that had the pattern of an optical illusion and a television bolted to the dresser as if someone might steal it, I turned off the lights and lay down and waited for the familiar parade of unkind thoughts to begin. Instead, a quiet. Instead, a hum from the highway outside the window. Instead, a small clink from the table by the door. I turned on the lamp. The scarf had fallen off its folded edge. Beside it, a small pile of salt, neat as a thumbprint. I hadn't put it there. I rubbed it between my fingers and tasted it, because if you're going to be a scientist of your own fear, you have to commit to your methods. It was salt. Just salt. The table was clean otherwise. No footprints, no chalk, no wind. I went to the front desk and asked for another room, farther from the road. The clerk, a kid with acne and a smile like a coat hanger, said, "Sure thing," and handed me a key card for 217. "You here for the fishing?" he asked, and I don't know why I almost said yes. "I'm just passing through," I said instead, and he nodded with the easy benevolence of someone who hasn't yet learned that through doesn't always mean exit. In the new room, I put the scarf in the drawer with the Bible. I put the salt in the sink and ran the water until the tap stuttered with its own coughing and swallowed the grains. I slept. I dreamed I was standing in Leona's at dusk, and the bell above the door was ringing and ringing and ringing, all on its own like an alarm for a fire that had decided not to come. In the morning, I got in my car and drove east until the fields grew smaller, and the hedgerows taller, and the roads more argumentative. I took a job that asked nothing of me except work. I spoke of Blackridge only in rooms where the lights were low enough that I could see the listening happen and thereby work a kind of counter-magic. If I can see your fear, then it is mine, and I can put it down. I know you want an ending. We always do, because endings suggest that what happened can be contained. I left. I am going to say that sentence slowly because it means less than it appears to, but it is what I have. I left. I took the scarf with me, and later, when my kitchen drawers needed cleaning, I found it again and folded it again and put it somewhere I cannot immediately name. In a box, in a bag, in the trunk of a car I no longer drive. Some nights I wake and listen, and there is only the kind of quiet that makes people in cities complain about the hum of their own blood. One day I will read an article that will not look like an article because it will be small and printed in a paper that does not post online. It will say something like, "Local couple presumed dead after," and then a word that suits the year, "incident." The sheriff will stand with his hands crossed at his middle like someone trying not to reach for a cigarette. He quit months ago. Leona will wipe her counter and say, "We take what we are given," and mean it differently this time. Audrey will sign a form. The siren will go off on a day when there's no weather, and someone will say, "It ain't weather." And the wind will do its little imitation of a human thought pressing itself against glass. I will not go back. I will not write a letter to the editor or try to send money or box up flashlights and batteries and salt. I have learned the kindness of not intervening in rituals you do not belong to. I will go to my kitchen and pour salt in a neat line along the windowsill and laugh at myself and leave it there anyway. I will unfold a scarf and place it over the back of a chair, and it will be just a scarf. It will also not be. I want to tell you a thing I am not supposed to say. There are places that host us, and there are places that host something else, and sometimes those are the same places. The Midwest isn't empty. It is patient. Blackridge is patient. It will wait the number of years the ledger allows. It will make its marks in chalk and in flour and in the breath you don't see when the heat is high. It will hum under the road. It will count. I didn't come to Blackridge to make friends. I came to fix a ledger. I left with a different ledger in my head, a list of lines I don't know how to reconcile. If you ask me to explain it, I will say it was like weather. If you ask me to swear to it, I will say there was a toy phone that rang without power and a door that everyone kept shut, including me, and a town that grieves in the tense of the present continuous. If you ask me for proof, I will hand you a scarf you cannot remember me taking. You will touch it and think of a small river and a high bank and a figure stepping backward into earth. You will ask me if the host is real. I will say, it depends on the year. You will ask me how often the town takes. I will say, every so often, which is a kindness. You will ask me if I'll ever go back. I will say, I didn't leave. Then I will correct myself because I am not a mystic. I am a man with a job and a deadline and a way of arranging facts into sentences that feel like fences. I will say, I left. On certain nights, at certain hours, when the wind changes, I hear a hum that is not mine. I don't open the window. I have learned that lesson. I sit and count to 1,000, then 5, then 10. I do not move even when something across the room clicks, as if someone has placed something small and precise on a table, then stepped back to admire the neatness of the offering. I do not speak the names I know. I do not show my teeth. When the sound finishes with the patience of a chore completed, I whisper the only prayer that belongs to me now. Hold, please, I say. Sometimes, not often, the wind holds.